Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 27. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're studying the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter, and each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 27, the top 3 issues are the meaning of the verb ulevaqqer in verse 4, the text, grammar, and meaning of verse 8, and the word Lule in verse 13, which in the Masoretic text is surrounded by a bunch of little dots. The first of our top issues for Psalm 27 is in verse 4. Verse 4 says, as we've translated it, "One thing I have asked of the Lord, I will seek it, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to contemplate in his temple." The issue is in the last line of this verse, the meaning of the word which we've translated as contemplate. In Hebrew, this word is ulevaqqer, a PL infinitive construct with a lamed preposition prefixed to it. The text of the whole last line reads, "Lachazot b'noam Adonai, ulevaqqer b'heichalo." Our interpretation of this line and of the word ulevaqqer as contemplate basically agrees with a number of other translations. The Net Bible, for example, says, "So I can gaze at the splendor of the Lord and contemplate in his temple." Other translations, though they use different words, are getting at the same idea. For example, the NLT has meditate, the CEV has pray, the GNT has to ask for his guidance. The basic idea is that the psalmist is there in the temple, prayerfully contemplating some decision he has to make. The word baqqer seems to have a similar meaning in Proverbs 20:25, which says, "It is a snare to say rashly, 'It is holy,' and to reflect, ulevaqqer, only after making vows." Here, ulevaqqer refers to an act of reflection or contemplation, something which in this case should have been done before deciding to make a vow. Or to give another example, there's a passage in Ben Sira that says, "Do not find fault until you've investigated. First consider, baqqer, then rebuke." That is, before you find fault with someone and rebuke him, study the situation and reflect on it. Think deeply about it so you can make the right decision. And so the use of the verb baqqer in Proverbs and in Ben Sira supports understanding it here in Psalm 27 in the sense of contemplate or meditate. In other passages, however, the same verb appears to have a slightly different meaning. Leviticus 13:36, for example, says, "Then the priest shall examine him, and if the itch has spread in the skin, the priest need not seek for ulevaqqer le, the yellow hair. He is unclean." So here the verb refers to a careful investigation, to the act of seeking. We find a similar use of the word in Ezekiel 34. "For thus says the Lord God, Behold, I myself will search for my sheep, and I will seek them out, uvikartim. As a shepherd seeks out his flock when he is among his sheep that have been scattered, so will I seek out, ulevaqqer, my sheep." Passages like these are probably why the NIV and the NEB both translate the phrase in Psalm 27:4 as "to seek him in his temple," and why other translations have "to inquire in his temple," that is, to seek information in his temple, information perhaps from a priest or a prophet. In these examples, however, the Leviticus example and the Ezekiel example, the verb baqqer is followed either by the direct object or by a lamed prepositional phrase, both of which indicate the thing which is being sought. By contrast, in Psalm 27, there's no direct object, there's no lamed prepositional phrase. It seems unlikely then that the verb means to seek here in Psalm 27. A number of other interpretations have also been proposed, and we don't have time in this video to explore all of them. Some translate the phrase as "to visit his temple," a translation which seems to be supported by some of the ancient versions. Others translate the phrase as "to visit early in his temple," understanding the verb baqqer as a denominative from the noun boker, which means morning. Others understand the phrase to refer to some sacrificial activity that the psalmist would have engaged in the temple. In the end, though a decision is difficult, we've followed the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, which glosses the word as contemplate, and defines it as an action by which someone gives careful thought to a certain issue in order to make an informed decision. Not only is this meaning clearly attested elsewhere, for example in Proverbs and in Ben Sira, it also seems to fit well in the psalm. It fits well in the immediate syntactic context where the word appears without a direct object, and it fits well in the broader context of the psalm, where the psalmist is in some kind of trouble and he's asking for the Lord to guide him. Here in verse 4, he expresses his desire to go to the temple, to see the Lord's beauty, and to contemplate in his temple, to prayerfully reflect on his situation in order to make an informed decision. If we were to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this view a C rating. The second issue in Psalm 27 is the text, grammar, and meaning of verse 8, probably the most difficult verse in the psalm. The Hebrew text here reads, Lecha amar libi bakshu fanai, et panecha Adonai ulevaqqer. Here we have two lines. The first line is Lecha amar libi bakshu fanai, and the second line is et panecha Adonai ulevaqqer. The second line is pretty straightforward, and most translations say something like, Your face, Lord, I will seek. The first line is where the difficulty lies, and here modern translations present us with a number of different options. The JPS 85 translation says, In your behalf, my heart says, seek my face. And it's accompanied by a note that says, meaning of Hebrew, uncertain. So the JPS 85 has chosen to interpret the Masoretic text as it's presented here, that is without recourse to emendation. It interprets the lamed prepositional phrase lecha, meaning on your or in your behalf. It reads amar libi, as my heart says, and it reads bakshu fanai, as the content of what his heart is saying, that is, seek the Lord's face. So according to this translation, the psalmist is recalling something that the Lord said, both to him and to the larger community of faith, seek my face. And then he responds in the next line, your face, Lord, I will seek. This is how some medieval Jewish commentators, including Rashi and Ibn Ezra, understood this verse. A number of translations in the King James tradition have another way of trying to make sense of this same Hebrew text without recourse to emendation. The RSV, for example, says, Thou hast said, seek ye my face. My heart says to thee, thy face, Lord, do I seek. This interpretation is similar to the previous one, in that the psalmist is here recalling the Lord's words. The Lord is the one saying, seek my face. And then in the next line, he's responding in obedience by saying, your face, Lord, I do seek. But then there are also some differences between this interpretation and the JPS interpretation. First, whereas the JPS interprets the lamed phrase lecha as meaning in your behalf, the RSV interprets it to refer to the addressee of the speech. My heart says to you or to thee. Second, whereas the JPS interprets the words my heart says as introducing the Lord's speech, seek my face, in the RSV these words, my heart says, are actually introducing the psalmist's speech in the next line. Your face, Lord, do I seek. The Lord's words in the first line, seek my face, are introduced by an elided you said, or thou hast said. Other translations not satisfied with either of these options have amended the text in various ways. The NRSV, for example, a revision of the RSV, says, Come, my heart says, seek his face. The NRSV here adopts three changes to the Masoretic text. First, the word lecha has been revocalized as lech, an imperative that means come. Second, the word panai, my face, has been changed to panav, his face. And third, the word bakshu, a plural imperative, has been changed to bakesh, a singular imperative. This amended Hebrew text and its translation makes good sense. The problem is that all three of these changes are unattested by any external textual evidence. Our oldest witness to the text, the Septuagint, basically agrees with the Masoretic text. It says, as the Netz version translates it, to you my heart said, my face sought. So the Septuagint interprets face, panai, not as the object, but as the subject of the verb seek, which it vocalizes not as an imperative but as a katal verb, bikashu instead of bakashu. And apart from this one difference in vowels, the text is identical to the Masoretic text. Given the relatively strong support for the reading of the Masoretic text, at least the reading of the consonantal text, it seems best to try and make sense of it before resorting to some of the more radical emendations that have been proposed, like that of the NRSV. So far then, we have three options on the table. We can interpret the first line along with the KJV tradition, which reads an elided "you said" before "seek my face," and then reads the words "my heart said" as an introduction to the psalmist's speech in the following line. That's one option. Option two, we can read it along with the JPS translation and the medieval Jewish interpreters who understood the lamed in the sense of on behalf of or in behalf of. Or option three, we can read the text with the Septuagint and some other ancient versions which see face not as the object but as the subject of the verb seek, which also requires a slight revocalization of the text. The first option is perhaps the least likely. It requires that the quotative frame, "my heart said," skips over the words "seek my face" to introduce the words in the next line, "your face, Lord, I will seek." We then have to imagine that another quotative frame, "you said," has been elided before the words "seek my face." All of this frankly feels very forced. The third option, supported not only by the Septuagint but also by the Syriac and the Latin versions, also seems unlikely. Face is more appropriate as the object of seeking than as the subject of seeking. In the B line of this very verse, for example, the psalmist says, "Your face, Lord, I will seek." And there are many other passages that talk about someone seeking someone's face. By contrast, there are no examples in the Hebrew Bible of a face doing the seeking. This leaves us with the second option, represented in the JPS 85 translation. "In your behalf, my heart says, seek my face." Whereas the other two options interpret the lamed preposition as an indirect object indicating the addressee, this option interprets the lamed to mean "in your behalf." And if this interpretation of the lamed is granted, then this interpretation of the verse solves a couple of major problems in the verse. First, it solves the problem of the mismatch between the singular ulevaqqer in the prepositional phrase and the plural seek, bakashu, in the verb. If we read the prepositional phrase lecha as the addressee, then the addressee is singular, but then the imperative which is addressed to this singular addressee is plural, bakashu. Reading the lamed as indicating something other than the addressee solves this problem. The JPS's interpretation of the lamed also solves the problem of the speaker in the words "seek my face." The psalmist is the one who's speaking these words, "seek my face." He explicitly introduces the words with "my heart says." And yet this seems like a very odd thing for the psalmist to tell other people to do. People are supposed to seek God's face, not the psalmist's face. But the problem is solved if the psalmist is speaking on God's behalf. That is, if the lamed prepositional phrase means "in your behalf" or "for you." But this interpretation of the phrase raises a question. Can a lamed prepositional phrase act in this way with a verb of speaking? There are numerous examples of lamed indicating the addressee or the topic of speech, but can it indicate the person on behalf of whom someone is speaking? Well, there are a couple of possible examples. One comes from Isaiah 5:1, which the ESV translates, "Let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard." Now, the lamed phrase here could mean that the prophet is singing a song to his beloved or for his beloved's enjoyment. It could also mean, and this seems maybe even more likely, that the prophet is singing a song about his beloved. But it's also possible that the prophet is singing a song on behalf of his beloved. That is, as a prophet, he is speaking on behalf of the Lord, his beloved. And this is how at least some medieval Jewish grammarians understood this particular passage. Another example is in Joshua 10:12, which the ESV translates, "At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord, La Adonai, in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Aijalon. Although the ESV and most other translations say that Joshua spoke to the Lord, Joshua doesn't actually address the Lord in this passage. Instead, he addresses the sun and the moon. So it might be better to read the lamed phrase to mean on behalf of the Lord. That is, Joshua spoke in the Lord's authority, as though the Lord himself were speaking through him, commanding the sun and moon to stand still. It could be the same thing as happening in Psalm 27. David is speaking on the Lord's behalf, and through David, the Lord is saying to his people, "Seek my face." In conclusion, then, we've chosen to read the lamed in the sense of on behalf of, or for, which allows us then to make sense of the verse as a whole. Although this view is not without problems, specifically the problem of the lamed having this unusual meaning, it seems like the least problematic of the views that have been put forward. We give it a D rating. The final issue in Psalm 27 is in verse 13. We've translated this verse as, "Had I not believed, I would look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." The Hebrew text reads, "Lule ha'amanti lir'ot b'tuv Adonai be'eretz chayim." Our translation of this verse reflects the same interpretation as that of the 1995 NASB, which says, "I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." The 1995 NASB and others interpret lule as a conditional conjunction, introducing a hypothetical condition. If I had not believed, or unless I had believed. The words, "I would have despaired," the apodosis or the then clause, have been supplied by the translator. The Hebrew text leaves this apodosis implicit. Had I not believed, I would look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Fill in the blank. The NASB fills in the blank with, "I would have despaired." Other translations fill in the blank with something similar, and others, like the Hebrew text, leave the blank for the reader to fill in for him or herself. The latest revision of the NASB, however, has something different. It says, "I certainly believe that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." Whereas the older NASB interpreted lule as a conditional conjunction, the new NASB interprets lule as an emphatic particle, certainly. And these are the two main options for interpreting lule. But before we think about how we ought to interpret lule, we need to decide if it belongs in the text at all. The ESV chooses to delete lule altogether. It says, "I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." And it indicates with a footnote that it is choosing to follow Hebrew manuscripts that do not include lule. There are several medieval Hebrew manuscripts which do not include the word lule. Most of the ancient versions also omit the word. The Septuagint omits part of the word. It keeps the lu, which it groups with the previous line and interprets as a lamed preposition with the 3ms suffix lo, but then it deletes the second half, le. There might even be evidence for deletion within the Masoretic text itself. Notice that the word lule is surrounded by dots above and below the word. The Masoretes refer to these dots as nukudot, and they occur a total of 15 times in the Masoretic text, 10 times in the Pentateuch and 5 times elsewhere. This is the only time nukudot occur in the book of Psalms. Actually, it's the only time they occur anywhere in the entire writing section of the Hebrew Bible. Some have argued that these dots indicate the need for deletion. Dots similar to these were used at Qumran to indicate deletion. In the Great Isaiah Scroll, for example, there are several examples of dots above letters indicating that these letters ought to be deleted. In the scroll known as 1QHA, a collection of non-biblical poems at Qumran, dots are sometimes used both above and below a word to indicate deletion, just like they're used here. Dots are also used in some Greek manuscripts to indicate deletion. Because it was hard to erase text written on parchment, scribes sometimes used dots instead. That the dots in the Masoretic text indicate deletion is also supported by the fact that 8 out of the 15 times the dots do occur, deletion of the letters in question is supported by some other witness to the text, for example, the Septuagint or the Samaritan Pentateuch. But in some cases, there is no manuscript evidence for deletion, and in some cases, it seems unlikely that the letters should be deleted, And so some have argued that the dots indicate something other than deletion. Perhaps they only indicate that there's some kind of doubt about the textual tradition, or maybe they're flagging some other kind of issue. In the end, we don't know exactly what these dots are meant to communicate. So in light of the uncertainty about the meaning of the dots, and in light of the fact that it's difficult to explain how Lule made its way into the text if it isn't original, we've decided not to delete it. The question then becomes, how should we interpret it? Is it an unreal conditional conjunction, if or unless, as the 1995 NASB translates it? Or is it an emphatic adverb, certainly, as the 2020 NASB translates it? Elsewhere, the word lule is usually an unreal conditional conjunction, unless or if. To cite just one example, there's a passage in Judges where Samson says, "If you had not plowed with my heifer Lule, then you would not have found out my riddle." By contrast, there's little to no clear evidence of Lule functioning as an emphatic adverb. The reason why some suggest that it doesn't function as a conditional in Psalm 27 and must function as something else, like an adverb, is because there's no apodosis, there's no then clause. In the Judges example, there's a clear prodosis and apodosis, a clear if clause and a clear then clause. If you had not plowed, prodosis, then you would not have found, apodosis. But in Psalm 27, there's no apodosis, there's no then clause, and so the argument goes, Lule probably doesn't introduce a prodosis here. But there are other examples in the Hebrew Bible of an if clause without a then clause. In Genesis 50, for example, Joseph's brothers say, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" Although the NIV uses what if to make the question sound natural in English, in Hebrew it simply begins with lu, which is similar to lule. If Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him, fill in the blank. It seems likely that something similar is going on in Psalm 27. The thought of what it would be like if the psalmist did not believe that he would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living was too awful to even mention, and so he leaves it to the reader's imagination. We give this interpretation a C rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. In verse 4, the psalmist expresses his desire to stay in the Lord's house, so that he can see the Lord's beauty and contemplate in his temple. As we learn later in the psalm, enemies have risen up against him, and he needs protection and guidance. In verse 11, for example, he says to the Lord, "Teach me your way and lead me in a level path because of my foes." Here in verse 4, he expresses his desire to go to the temple where he can seek the Lord's guidance. That is, where he can prayerfully contemplate in his temple what it is he ought to do. In verse 8, the psalmist grounds his prayer for help in the Lord's own words. The Lord has said, or more specifically, the psalmist has said on the Lord's behalf, "Seek my face." That is, when you come into trouble, seek me, and I will help you. The psalmist responds to these words of the Lord in the second half of verse 8. "Your face, Lord, I will seek." That is, Lord, I'm doing what you've told me to do. You've told me to seek your face, and so I'm seeking your face. Now have mercy on me and hear my prayer. After verse 8, the psalmist makes a series of pleas to the Lord. "Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn me away. Do not abandon me. Teach me your way," and so on. All the while, he believes that the Lord will hear him. He trusts that the Lord will rescue him and that he will look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Had he not believed it, he would have despaired. But he does believe it, and so he waits for the Lord to answer. As he says in the next verse, the final verse of the psalm, "Wait for the Lord. Be courageous and let your heart become strong. Yes, wait for the Lord." This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 27, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our poetic features video explores the natively Hebrew poetic nature of the psalm. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at cdbr.org to learn more.